Hey everybody, I'm Richard, and I'm here to talk to you today about what is best in life. So a bit about my background. I started out at university studying engineering and I hated it. And then I quickly switched to philosophy and I loved it. And now 10 years later, my job title is front-end engineer. And I guess engineering isn't so bad after all. Right? But as Evia said, I've been coming to front-end London for quite a while, like 4 years now. And this is my first time getting up on stage. When I first started coming here, I was a bit too nervous to actually talk to anyone in person, so in the pub, so I just watched the talks and go straight home afterwards. But after time, I actually started talking to people, and it's become a big part of my life in London. Like, I met some close friends here, I found a new co-worker here, I learned about the Co-Bar community here, and which Joe spoke about last month, and you should definitely come join us, come coach or be a student. And I got my current job through the Front End London Slack group, which you should also totally join. Doing Patrick's job here because he's not here today. But yeah, join the Front End London Slack. And no, that would happen without made by many. So thanks team. But this talk isn't about me. It's about ethics. And so I mentioned that my official job title these days is front end engineer, although I usually refer to myself as a developer. I've always felt a bit uncomfortable with the idea of calling myself an engineer, though I couldn't really put my finger on why. Like, maybe it felt like a bit like I was claiming some sort of prestige that I hadn't earned. And I didn't complete my engineering degree, as I said. I didn't study computer science. I'm mostly self-taught. I think I'm pretty good at my job most days, but I still feel like I'm basically hacking stuff together a lot of the time. And back in the day, we who build websites used to call ourselves webmasters, which I still think is an amazing job title. Like, I'm kind of sad that I didn't start my career early enough to have a webmaster role in my job history CV. Like, I'm sure there might be a few like webmasters here, former webmasters. Yeah, awesome.
Webmistress.
Oh, yes, nice, of course, yeah, yeah. Anyway, so we're webmasters or webmistresses, and then we were web developers, and now a lot of us are front-end engineers. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It's totally fine, or that we should stop calling ourselves engineers. Call yourself whatever you want. Like, you could be a techno Viking or an agile pirate ninja riding a full-stack glitter unicorn if it makes you feel better, like, whatever. But we used to be working, yeah, had to. We used to be working on dinky little websites that were kind of thrown together, like this. And now we're working on massive professional operations that form the financial backbone of multi-billion-dollar corporations. We've come a long, long way from being webmasters and webmistresses. But a lot of us are self-taught and didn't go through any standardized training process. And don't get me wrong, I think this is great. It helps ease barriers to entry. And it makes it easier to get into the industry. It's perfect. I wouldn't change a thing. But as the industry gets more professional, really quickly, it might be worth thinking about some of the other trappings of professionalism. Like, if we're going to call ourselves engineers, there are ethical duties and responsibilities that go along with that title. So, 100 years ago, civil engineering was in a similar situation to how the tech industry is now. As the Industrial Revolution receded behind them, engineers found new ways to use all the fancy new technologies that they developed. They grew more sophisticated in their approach, and their projects ballooned in scale and complexity. But as these projects became more ambitious, there was an accompanying problem. There was a rise in major engineering disasters. The turn of the 20th century saw a wave of epic structural failures, including some massive bridge collapses, and also the Great Boston Molasses Flood, which you can see here, which, if I had to name my favorite disaster, this would have to be it, just the mental image of a tsunami of liquid sugar 50 feet high, traveling at 35 miles an hour, just consuming everything in its path. Like, it's terrifying, but also kind of delicious. Anyway, too soon? I don't know. Anyway, these disasters had a profound effect on the way the public saw engineering, and forced engineers to confront their shortcomings. And as a result, they began to regulate themselves more intensely and establish standardized industry codes of ethics. So what is ethics? Ethics is a branch of philosophy devoted to answering questions about what is best in life. Questions like these. And I know what you're all thinking. I can see the cogs in your software developer minds turning over. You're thinking, that's easy. What is best is both spaces and tabs on alternating lines. A good life is when the client is banned from feature requests. You should live by only supporting one browser. you should interrupt people when they have their headphones on. And the purpose of life is replacing everything with JavaScript. You're all monsters. But I'm kind of with you on that client thing. Like, I'd like to go one step further and ban all clients, but that's a different topic for another day. Hashtag ban all clients. Anyway, philosophers like to do things called thought experiments, which are like real experiments, but much better because you don't actually need to get out of your armchair. And one of the most famous of these is the trolley problem. I'm sure that many of you are already well familiar with it. It's a bit of a cliche at this point, but bear with me. But for those who aren't, here's the deal. There's a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. And ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. And the trolley is heading straight for them. You're standing some distance off them in the train yard, next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, you notice that there's one person on the side track. You have 2 options. Do nothing, and the trolley kills the 5 people on the main track. Or pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track where it will kill one person. So which is the most ethical choice? Now, here's the moment of truth. Quick show of hands, no wrong answers. Which of you would pull the lever? Okay. And which of you would not pull the lever? Alright, okay, cool. So there's an alternate version of this, where, like, imagine instead of a switch, you're standing on a bridge over the tracks next to an extremely large man. Now the trolley's coming, and the only way you can stop it is to push the large man onto the tracks. You're not big enough to stop the trolley. He's the only one who can just jam the wheels. And he's looking you right in the eyes. He can see what you're thinking. He's terrified, begging you not to do it. What do? Which of you would push the large man? A few this time? Okay. And which of you would not push the large man? Okay, alright. That's interesting. So, this trolley problem has been the subject of many surveys over the years, and they tend to find kind of what we found here, that approximately 9 out of 10 respondents would throw the switch to kill the one, say the 5, but in the large man scenario, the situation reverses, and only 1 in 10 people would push him over the tracks. Incidentally, a 2009 survey of professional philosophers found that only 68% of them would throw the switch, 8% would not switch, and the remaining 24% basically just froze up and couldn't answer, or just had another view. So if you're ever tied to the train tracks by a cartoon villain, you better hope that the person by the switch isn't a moral philosopher. Anyway, I just love that statistic. So why the difference in the 2 outcomes? One theory is that it's because 2 different parts of your brain are fighting with each other. Basically, some researchers looked at people's brains using fMRI machines and demonstrated that personal dilemmas, like pushing a man off a footbridge, engage brain regions associated with emotion, while impersonal dilemmas, like diverting a trolley by flipping a switch, engage regions associated with controlled reasoning. And these different brain processes essentially compete with each other whenever you have to make a tough moral decision. Basically, inside your brain, you've got a monkey and a robot fighting over the controls. And each time you have to make a moral decision, they're duking it out. And the monkey understands something simple like pushing someone off a bridge, and it's horrified, right? But it doesn't understand something complex like a mechanical switch. So in that situation, the gut response is reduced, and we're able to throw the lever without feeling such a crushing sense of moral panic. Now, some people have a stronger monkey, and some people have a stronger robot, and that's great, because both are useful in different situations. But this is tricky for we programmers, because we work on complex problems, right? And which make it trickier for our monkey brains to trigger some kind of moral response. By the way, if you think it's hard for programmers to experience the full range of ethical response, then spare a thought for autonomous vehicles. Self-driving cars don't have brains, and will not have meat brains anyway, and you can't make a perfectly ethical algorithm. You can only make it as good as the humans who programmed it, and we can't even agree to whether to use tabs or spaces. There were also some really tricky problems here that self-driving cars will face. Like, we prefer a self-driving car swerve into a pile of trash rather than hit someone, just like a person might. But computers can make these sorts of decisions quicker than we can, so if we decide in advance what we want them to do, they'll follow our instructions once the sensors are good enough. So we'll probably want to program our car to hit a single adult rather than a busload of school children, right? But what if the adult is a Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher? What if the adult is driving the car? Would we want the car to sacrifice its driver? And would you choose to buy a self-driving car that's designed to sacrifice your life to save others? Some researchers at MIT came up with a nice solution for this. They built an app to mine data on people's answers to different trolley problems, so they can use it to help them decide how autonomous cars should behave in different scenarios. The website's called Moral Machine, and you can go there right now, or maybe I can wait till after the talk, but you can go there right now and start judging scenarios, just like this one, where you have to choose to decide between a male athlete driving a car and a jaywalking baby. You baby jaywalk. On the one hand, the baby probably doesn't know not to cross on a red signal. So on the other hand, it might grow up to be Hitler, so it's a tough call. Anyway, Moral Machine is cool, but it doesn't help us because we can't outsource all our ethical decision making to the internet. We're just individuals working on our laptops, and we have these ridiculous neat brains, and we have to make all our own decisions about things like whether to kill baby Hitler. So, of course, we sometimes make the wrong call. Now let's shift gears a little and consider the Volkswagen emissions scandal. You might recall that VW added special software to millions of diesel cars that would detect when the exhaust fumes were being checked by emissions regulators and change performance to pass these tests. And as a result, they managed to completely bypass regulation standards in the US, EU, and elsewhere for a period of about 5 years. This workaround allowed them to emit up to 40 times more nitrogen oxide than what US emission standards allow. And by some estimates, air pollution causes around 40,000 early deaths per year in the UK alone. So it's pretty safe to assume that over time, Volkswagen's technical hack is likely to result in several thousand early deaths, plus thousands more cases of asthma and other lung disease. And as someone who just, in the last few months, recently started experiencing asthma symptoms for the first time since I was a child, probably because of London's air pollution, I take this kind of personally. And so when I heard that one of the engineers at VW was recently in prison for a scandal, I thought, good. But on the other hand, I've got to give them credit where it's due. VW's defeat device is a brilliant technical hack, frankly. It's ingenious. I can imagine that the engineers created it must have felt kind of proud of themselves at the time. But at the same time, you also kind of wonder why nobody spoke up at one of the internal meetings and say, hey pals, do you think maybe we're being complete assholes here? How did they get it so wrong? And maybe it's because the monkey part of their brain was completely unable to deal with the complexity of the problem. You've got cars and software hacks and air pollution, and then decades later some people you don't know might die, and it's all a bit much for the poor monkey to handle. So we established earlier that ethical reasoning involves an internal struggle for control. And a weird thing about humans is that we sometimes actually forget to act ethically when we're so focused on achieving a goal that we forget to think about the consequences of our actions. Or else we justify it to ourselves in ways that don't stand up to scrutiny, but we never stop to properly reflect on it. I'm sure everyone in this room has done this at some point. I definitely have, and it's led to some of my biggest screw-ups. When you're looking at a wall of code, it's very easy to forget about the human face of those who will be affected by your decisions. And unlike civil engineering, it's usually pretty easy to fix mistakes. You just roll out a patch or an update. And so in tech, we like to move fast and break things, but we don't want to move fast with oncoming traffic and break people. There's some good news though. It's easy for people to act unethically. If it's easy for people to act unethically when they don't think about it, the flip side of this is it follows that people tend to behave more ethically when you remind them to. And it can happen even when you do it in subtle ways. For instance, some researchers in Newcastle found that just hanging out posters of staring human eyes in a cafeteria was enough to significantly change people's behavior, and it made people twice as likely to clean up after themselves. So if just a poster of eyes can achieve that much, then imagine what else we could accomplish with a few well-placed reminders. So far, I've covered a few examples of ethical dilemmas in software engineering, but what are some examples of ethical decisions that specifically affect front-end developers? Well, security, for a start, right? So caring about proper website security is a thankless task, where your manager or client often won't notice if you've done your job right. But if you don't do it, you can run the risk of pulling an Equifax and completely screwing up your users. Similarly, you're making a moral decision and choosing how much effort to put into accessibility. I mean, if you work somewhere like GDS or something, like it's a core part of your mission. But for a lot of us, it ends up being something that can be one of the first things that you kind of forget about. And in my experience, it's often a choice between being lazy and making access possible for disabled people. Finally, deciding who to work for and prioritizing what to work on. That was the joke aimed at Oliver.
That was beautiful.
So deciding who to work for and prioritizing what to work on. Like, would you work for a tobacco company, a gun manufacturer, a gambling website, or a porn website? So what can we do to help developers make ethical decisions? I think the best thing we can do is to use the power of reminders and the fact that people tend to mimic the examples they see around them. So the real question is, what can we do to establish an organizational culture where people tend to act morally and where there are lots of positive examples for us to emulate? I mentioned before that many engineering industry bodies introduced formal codes of ethics in the early 20th century. And these came along with more legal regulations and barriers to entry, which I don't think is a good idea for us. But ethical codes are a great idea. And no need to read all of this, but they're a very good way to remind people to act ethically. Because basically, when you tell people don't be a dick, they tend to be less likely to be a dick. So we already do this with codes of conduct at conferences, meetups, including this one, and open source GitHub repositories, among other things. And we can do this at our organizations too. Like, they don't have to be complicated. In fact, the simpler the better. Like, this one's just 7 points. The most important thing is to set appropriate expectations of ethical behavior. Now, another thing we can do is establishing decision-making tools. So I have a therapist friend who tells me that one of the ways they encourage ethical behavior with therapists is to build ethics checks into their processes. So whenever they're trying to make a hard decision, they have these questions they can use, which are designed to trigger different types of emotional responses. So you've got the first one here, which I think is quite a monkey brain question. Like it's basically good for triggering an emotional response like shame. And for example, if you're considering being lazy about making your website accessible, imagine there's a disabled person sitting right next to you, and think about whether you'd be comfortable explaining your code choices to them. The second one seems designed to trigger more of a consequentialist response, like maybe it's a bit of a rationalist robot response. It's kind of, yeah. And the last one reminds me a little bit of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, like that you should only do something if you'd be okay with it being a universal law. So that's cool with Kant's thing, like sure, cool. Overall, I really like them, like good job psychotherapists. I'm really impressed. Now, another thing we do is empower developers to say no. And yeah, so a few years ago, I was working for a consultancy who assigned me to a website project for a client I didn't approve of. But I got so invested in just solving the technical aspects of the project and thinking about how I'd accomplish it, that I didn't stop to think about whether I was morally okay with working for this client until I was already deeply invested. I moaned about the client to some colleagues, like halfway through the project, and they told me, if you didn't want to work for this client, that's fine, but you probably should have said something at the start of the project. Like, fair enough, right? But it made me realize that it's okay to say no to clients, but also that the appropriate time to do this is before you start work. The later you leave it, the harder it is to say no. Which I think is pretty obvious stuff, but like it just took me a while to really think about, and I hadn't really properly, I was just too busy just thinking about the coding problems. So, now that they said, okay, it's okay to say no, the next time a dodgy client came along, I felt more comfortable expressing my concerns up front, and we ended up turning down the client. So I just realized that if you have these conversations up front, it just makes people, brings it out in the open. Finally, we can help engineers develop more empathy for our users by encouraging them to meet them in person. A great way to do this is to get developers to sit on user testing sessions. A nice additional benefit of this is that empathy for users helps you design better user-centered solutions too. So it's win-win, right? Thanks. So if you have any more suggestions that you think I've missed, please come talk to me, either in the pub afterwards or get in touch online using one of my imaginative online usernames. By the way, quick plug for my company. We're Quantum Black. I know the company name sounds kind of sinister, but we're actually a completely legitimate organization.
Specific denial.
We have lots of offices around the world. Some of my friendly co-workers, you see we're a diverse team. We could do better in leadership, but we're working on it. And this is my boss, he's a big animal lover. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my talk. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Although you might find that, like Socrates here, I only know that I know nothing. Okay, thanks.
All right, hold on. Let me bring the mic around.
This is great, thanks. Have you ever considered in your kind of like, deepest dreams to formulate the equivalent of the 7 rules of the civil engineers, but for software engineering? Like, do you ever think that there is like a list that we could make for software engineering similarly?
I think we probably could. I'd probably start by just plagiarizing what engineers have already been doing. That's my general approach to most things, to be honest. Just build on someone else's existing thing. And I did start Googling around for some of these when I was writing this talk. There are ones that exist. I just hadn't heard of them before until I started writing this talk. So, I mean, there are certain industry bodies. I just don't think that's how we tend to operate. At least not in London. Like, I don't know of anyone who's in like a big like software developers union or anything. So yeah, I mean, it'd be great to come up with these examples out there. It's just getting them out there, I think.
All right, thanks.
Hey Richard.
Hi.
So obviously you work at Crowbar.
Mm-hmm.
How would you, obviously kind of getting new developers in, especially junior roles, they're going to be kind of under a lot of pressure to kind of possibly take on more unethical tasks. I mean, they might kind of be desperate for a role, etc. How would you kind of go about kind of empowering them to kind of make that ethical decisions?
Right. So I think that depends a lot on your ethical, how you see ethics. I'm a consequentialist. My answer to that would be I would think about cost benefit. So I would decide that basically are these sacrifices, are they for the greater good? Is me turning down this job, what's the benefit of that? I think in a lot of cases, there's not a lot of demonstrable benefit for screwing yourself out of a job. But then sometimes it's good to make a stand. It's a tough call. If you are more of a deontologist, it might be a different. I don't know. Talk to me after the pub. This is a hard question.
Any other questions? All right, got one here.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I feel like there's maybe some other tool we could use to help us have a say to our companies whenever we ask to do something unethical, and it's unionizing. Do you think that's a tool that would help employees? Because
You say unionizing?
yeah, a union. I think I'm not too big on the law side of things, but maybe part of the reason they exist is to give employees the voice when they're asked to do something unethical. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's a useful tool?
Without going too much into politics, yeah, sure, right. I mean, I'm not an expert on that subject. I think that's going a little bit beyond my area of expertise, but broadly sounds good. I'd be willing to entertain that.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Oh, yep.
In your own opinion, with sort of the emergence of sort of big data and so forth, and how platforms are now using that to make recommendations on Facebook and so forth like that, what is your opinion about that? Do you think it is somewhat unethical to sort of pry on people's impulses almost to increase revenue, or do you think it can be used for better long-term benefits that sort of create proper value?
Right. So I don't claim to speak for anyone, for everyone, sorry. So on my good days I speak for myself. Yeah, I don't know, it's a really complex, privacy is a really complicated issue, and I keep on equivocating, going back and forth a little bit. I tend to come back always to that cost-benefit analysis, just look at the harms. I think there's great things you can do with big data. Think about medicine and just in changing the way government works. You can, there's lots of optimizations you can make, and you do fantastic things, but also you don't want to be intrusive, you don't want to actually just create a dystopian society. It's a balance, it's complicated, sorry.
This is the frame dilemma.
Yeah. There's a reason people hate moral philosophers.
Oh, yeah, here you go.
Do you have any tips on discussions of ethics with colleagues?
Ooh, great. No.
You're really good at this.
I don't. Trying to understand other people's point of view, giving other people the benefit of the doubt, rather than trying to railroad people. I generally assume everyone's on some kind of journey that they someone was saying to me yesterday, like everyone is facing pressure from somewhere, and rather than just assuming, I think there's this like psychological capacity. People tend to assume that their own motivations are pure and great, and everyone else is being a dick. And just trying to get past that and just see things from other people's point of view is a really good start. And then just like build. Once you can build trust with someone, that helps, I think.
Cool. All right then. Everyone, please put your hands together for Richard.